Namaskar viewers, hello and welcome to Sunset TV. I'm Tina Jha, you're watching Perspective. On the show today, we will talk about the India-Australia relationship. What are the areas in which India and Australia have firmed up initiatives to enhance their cooperation? How have India-Australia relations evolved over the years? These are some of the aspects on which we will get perspectives from distinguished panelists who are joining us on the program. So let me first welcome them on the program. In fact, I'm pleased to welcome on this edition of Perspective on Sunset TV, former Ambassador Mr. Vishnu Prakash, Professor Amitabh Mattu, Director, Australia-India Institute, and Dr. Sreeram Chaulia, Foreign Affairs Expert. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us on this program on Sunset TV. Quick question, Dr. Chaulia, to you to understand the newer areas of cooperation that we have firmed up in this particular virtual summit that was held on the 21st between Prime Minister Modi and his Australian counterpart.
Well, Tina, the first thing, then one of the new areas is the critical minerals sector. This is where, Australia is very well endowed. China controls about 50% of the more of the world's rare earths, which go into manufacturing all sorts of things. So critical minerals is one area where we are establishing a solid partnership with Australia, which will enable our Make in India initiatives and also diversify our supply chain and make them more resilient and avoid the monopoly of the Chinese control over major inputs for industrialization. The other thing is also critical and emerging technologies. They talked about tech with democratic values and human rights. This is mentioned in the joint statement, and both the sides have spoken about how we can cooperate on technology. Bengaluru is emerging as a major hub for Australian presence. They've opened a new consulate there, and they want to engage more with Indian entrepreneurs in the high-tech sector. There's a cyber security angle to that also, where they're now increasingly cooperating. So these are some of the emerging areas. I will also mention one, the defense side is also one way emerging, because Australia has changed its approach. Australia has now become a major spender on defense. It was somewhat of a middle player in this field, but now Scott Morrison government actually committed to $200 billion of military spending this decade. That's a significant increase, an enhancement. They're also talking about a 30% increase in the size of the Australian military. They're also hosting more US bases. We have a military logistics agreement, MLSA agreement with the Australians for interoperability of the navies. That is now being enhanced. So on all these counts, the Australians have clearly realized that geopolitically and geostrategically and even economically, India is much more important to them now. For counterbalancing China, definitely. Also for creating this, what we call free and open Indo-Pacific. So on all these counts, I think the convergence is growing, and that's where there's so much momentum.
Dr. Chaulia, so when we talk about shared interests, and of which both Professor Mattu and the Ambassador have spoken about, one significant takeaway from this virtual summit has been the letter of intent towards concluding migration and mobility partnership agreement. Now, if I could understand from you, how significant is it for us from the Indian point of view?
Yeah, well, Tina, Australia has been slammed by refugee rights and other human rights advocates in the past for shutting its doors to asylum seekers. But on the other hand, the Indian migration is mostly skilled workers. So we would like them to offer greater opportunities for our services and for free movement of our professionals. And I think that's one area of migration mobility relates to that. And that will, of course, also increase investments on both sides. If there is easier movement of professionals without many barriers, then it enhances two-way FDI flows as well. So definitely those things matter. A lot of our students who go there also want to convert after studying and also find jobs there in Australia. But I would also want to mention one other point, which is the regional factor here. Both Mattu Saab and Ambassador Prakash mentioned it. The statement at the end of the summit talked about, Prime Minister Modi welcomed Australia's enhanced engagement in the Indian Ocean. Now, this is, I think, very critical. And in the past, there have been people who are skeptical, saying, well, Australia is minding the Western Pacific, and then India is minding the Indian Ocean. And even though there is an Indo-Pacific, which is supposed to bring the two together, there's not much, because the Indian Navy doesn't go that far up to the Western Pacific, and the Australian Navy is not coming this far into the Indian Ocean to enable India's interests. But I think now there's a clear interoperability, the factor I was mentioning earlier. So at the strategic level, I think this is another factor that's going to play a big role going forward, because when we say Indo-Pacific, for it to fructify, for it to materialize, for it to really become a living reality, then Australia and India are the key pillars. And Japan, of course, is also there, another key partner. So the US commitments, whether the US remains fully committed or not, we have to see in the long run, but we would hope that they would. In order to contain China, but even in their absence, or if they are, they're only with a half of a mind, we still want cooperation among the middle powers in this region. So Australia, India, I think the cement that is binding them together, because the Chinese, as Matusav was mentioning, the Chinese influence operations, the kind of interference they're doing in Australia, this become a big political, it's a snowball into a big political controversy in Australia. They don't want to become a colony of China. So I think that's the kind of context in which we see that the Indo-Pacific is really becoming and that is something to. Recently, the Australian Army Chief was here, and we had lots of fruitful talks on how to increase the engagement. The navies are also meeting. So I think those will ultimately override, the smaller issues of migration and mobility. I mean, of course, they matter to people who want access. But something bigger is happening. That's why we call it a comprehensive strategic partnership.
Mr. Chaulia, concluding remark from you on how do you look at the future of India-Australia relationship? We've been able to build on several fronts a very, very strong partnership. But now, of course, going forward, the challenge will be to sustain this relationship that we have built in the last few years, considering the fact that for several decades, there were indifferences of which we spoke about with Professor Mattu earlier in the show.
Yeah, it's a transformed reality, Tina. And I look at the bilateral relationship as embedded in our broader Act East policy and our broader regional strategy for the Indo-Pacific. We are ramping up our Indo-Pacific partnerships with a renewed zeal. It's not a coincidence that there's been a summit Prime Minister Modi did with Scott Morrison, and then almost simultaneously with Fumio Kishida, the Japanese Prime Minister. So Japan and Australia both matter, and we are building closer and closer networks and making it more interoperable for all these three and beyond. We want to expand and bring in more members into some kind of, hopefully a kind of a broader Quad Plus, informally at least. And that's the way forward to counterbalance the hegemonic threat that we face from China. So I think this is not going to go away. It's a long-term project, and Australia has committed to it, and Australia has shifted gears. Australia wants to be a bigger player in the geopolitical scenario. And of course, it wants a bigger pie in the Indian market, in the share of the Indian market. So I think if you look at all these factors, this is actually going to go only one way, which is up.
The kind of transformation we have seen, we're all positive that this relationship is only going to grow in the times to come. So that having been said, I'll have to wrap up the discussion today. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program today, sharing your perspective with us, taking us through how India-Australia relationship has evolved over the years and the future that we see of both countries. It was a pleasure having you on the program.